welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd talk a little bit today about the U.S. Navy and its the number of ships it has. There have been a number of changes going on. The number of aircraft carriers have been changing. The number of other ship types have been changing, and there have been some new ship types introduced, like the littoral classes, like the Independence class. Austin, what is the right size for the U.S. Navy?
Well, first thing you got to ask and answer, and you don't have to answer it perfectly, but you have to come up with a good answer, good enough to provide guidance that will shape, at a minimum, your next 5 to 10 years of naval construction and equipment budgets, but also looking even beyond that into 2 decades, i.e. 25 years, because of the complexity and size of maritime combat systems. Say that instead of Navy. I'm not trying to play jargon with it, but there's an entire range of weapons and weapon systems that you don't associate with ships, hulls, in other words, subs, surface ships, and the like, that actually contribute a great deal to naval operations, not even not just surveillance or communications, but even combat capabilities. Now, we did a strategy talk a long time ago where one of the things Jim brought up, mines, how sea mines don't get any respect. And it was taking it from something that we had on strategy page, but also something that showed up in How to Make War. But that's what I mean, Dan, before I start on this, and what do you want your Navy to do, is that you have to look at the entire of technological capabilities, understand how they can be integrated and organized, and you can have the same systems, but you organize them differently, and you get a different, not entirely different capabilities, but a different expression of those capabilities to meet mission requirements. And that is. And let me give you another example before I go to say, what do you want us to do? The U.S. Navy deploys underwater surveillance devices to track, from the Cold War, it was to track Russian submarines. But it can do other things as well, and it enhances the effectiveness of American attack subs, the safety of American ballistic missile submarines, and when you connect it in where we have multiple platforms, I'm going to say platforms, and I think that's a better word when you think about it. That's the way the F-35 guys like to talk about it, because we just had an article on strategy page just this past week. F-35s can guide in MLRS, and essentially turning a longer range MLRS into an aircraft delivered. It's not. The F-35's guiding it. You can do some things similar under the sea, on the sea, and above the sea, and in littoral areas. Now, stepping back from that and understanding, in other words, you've got a lot of options out there. You've only got so much money. You've also, and this is something else I'm going to cue Jim, because it's always interesting when he'll talk about this. You've also got, I guess I would call it churches within sects within the Navy on who's can do what. Similar way the Air Force would fight over between bombers and fighters, and the Navy, you've got your surface action element, and then the naval air, and then the submarines. But nevertheless, you have to as the job of senior U.S. Department of Defense leadership, senior Navy leaders, is to integrate capabilities. And ultimately, the real job is to protect the United States from attack and also protect U.S. interests, which leads to back what I said, what do you want the U.S. Navy to do? Now, the thing is, the United States wants the U.S. Navy to be able to do everything. Line that shows up, why didn't the Navy do this? Or we don't have enough to cover this. Or look what's going on in, well, we'll talk about the South China Sea. We talk about it all the time because that is, in my view, one of the three more likely maritime conflict zones. It may be the one that is the most dangerous, but you can't rule out Baltic Norway, and you can't rule out East China Sea. In other words, Japan, South Korea. You still can't rule out Straits of Hormuz, even though that's really a different kind of potential clash. Is that if you want the Navy to do everything, then you've got to have multi-purpose ships, say that, that can conduct patrols and project power, and projecting power either from just a show of force, showing the flag, to running freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs. We've talked about that on Strategy Talk, did a couple of years ago after an American guided missile destroyer raced past one of those fake islands that the Chinese have made in the South China Sea, and there was an incident. There was a recent incident, too. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy vessel coming within, I think it was about 60 feet, 70 feet of an American naval vessel in what we regard as open seas, and the Chinese now, after building the fake islands, claim it's just as much sovereign Chinese territory as Shanghai is. That's one of the things we want, freedom of navigation, because the United States supports free and secure international trade. Put down piracy. We have rules, too, that guide what is a maritime boundary, how far out your actual authority, a nation's actual authority, goes into the water. And then we've also got agreements governing what are, the EEZs, exclusive economic zones. At some point, the United States wants Navy and our Coast Guard, and Coast Guard being much more oriented to North America, not exclusively, but for the most part, North America, to protect the natural resources that belong to the United States and its allies, and these exclusive economic zones, to make sure that they're secure enough that a would-be regional hegemon, Russia, China, just to name two, wouldn't make a grab to grab a maritime zone. Now, would that happen? Well, it's happening in the South China Sea. So let's just put it up, and then we want a Navy that is capable of fighting a near peer in an extended Navy war. It's not just going to be on the sea, but that would be the primary instrument in a sea zone. At least it would, especially if you're a expeditionary power like the United States. Now, with China, and we've talked about this too, China has developed operations, and they're complex super operations designed to deny the U.S. Navy access to near the East Asian coast, primarily Chinese coast, but also to keep the United States even out of the South China Sea. And they're not all naval platforms. Ballistic missiles. Jim, what is that? The DF-21? I think isn't that the name of that? Okay, all right. I just bring that up as an example system that has maritime warfare capability, or supposed to have it, that's fired on land and aimed at supposedly is the anti-carrier missile. Well, then we're going to want the Navy to have the ability to operate in a threat area where you could conceivably a high-value ship like an aircraft carrier could be struck by essentially an IRBM that has a very precise and maneuverable warhead. So we're going to have to put anti-missile capabilities, and not just short range. Of course, we've already done that. The Navy's got, I think, 33 ships right now that are ballistic missile defense ships carrying a various type of standard, the standard threes, even though there's some standard twos that have ABM capability. So you're going to have that. You're going to have hulls that can handle the target acquisition, sensor, and surveillance acquisition capability, and also carry the missiles. You're also going to have ships eventually, as we start, and Navy's already deployed test examples of this, is we're moving to beam weapons. Now, beam weapons may answer both an anti-air and anti-missile threat in the high threat area. So what you're looking at is a mix of ships that complement each other. The fancy word synergy, but let's just go ahead and use it. It's complement. Think of it as Grand Maritime Combined Arms, except that's just one way to express it. And so it's not simply a number of ships. There is a decision to be made about types of ships, but this is something else we pointed out on strategy page, and heck, there's a couple of good articles on this and some of the defense literature I've read within the last couple of months on the nomenclature of contemporary ships. The Zumwalt is as big as a World War II heavy cruiser, and it's still classified as a destroyer, even though it also looks like something out of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's very large, compared to some other surface ships, and it really isn't a destroyer. Well, what is it? If you go in and you start looking also at shared capabilities, which is another way, or similar capabilities, you find out that some smaller ships actually have some of the system, like in a high threat, fight a naval war in a high threat area. I'm not leaving subs out. I'm gonna take the bet that the U.S. Navy and Royal Navy, but primarily U.S. Navy, because of the size of it, are the best at integrating attack subs into fleet operations. And they're not only surveillance and sensors out there, scouts, they're capable of providing very extensive defense for an American fleet. Now, I've laid out the range of the requirements and have been specific in some areas because I know that the missile threat is real. It's not just a ballistic missile threat, because hypersonic cruise missiles from aircraft, or even fired from some of those artificial islands. You come into the South China Sea on the surface, you're in a crossfire. Thing is, the Chinese are also in a crossfire. If coming into, if you're fighting a naval battle in that zone, they're laying out the specific capabilities, sketching some other capabilities required. You still come down to a question of the number of hulls because of the size of the world, and it seems that 250 ships isn't going to cut it, because you've always got the regeneration cycle, training, maintenance, and deployment, and then stand down. And that's the rule of three. You've got, so if 250 doesn't work, 225, does 300 work? Unless you get into some of the operations research analysis. But it's also judgment. It's not just opinion. It's best judgment. It's you might be able, in many places, be able to support both American diplomatic and military security objectives with a small ship in the right place. And I know you can, and I can think of several scenarios where a littoral combat ship is more than enough, because its presence is there, and it can bring everything else if it had to. So there's the argument that everything must be quote unquote high end, meaning the do-it-all kind of ship. I don't buy, because I know some less capable, but still provided with outstanding communications capability and drones can provide a lot of the capabilities that American maritime policy needs. So somewhere above 320, I think, is the number. I know what's the number they're aiming at, that we're talking about deploying now, Jim. 360 or something like that.
Yeah, it varies between 320 and then 355, 360.
All right, so I'll shut up now and let Jim respond to it. So,
yeah, Jim, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first, what kind of war are you thinking of? You might get into. We're focused on China, which is basically the only hostile fleet we have to worry about. North Korea and Iran, they don't really have, a high seas fleet. They have coastal fleets, and in both cases, they're decrepit. They haven't been able to buy or build new ships, or very few of them. And so they are not a major threat. A major threat is China. China has probably the best shipbuilding capability in the world right now. Now, that is an outrageous statement, but look at performance. They are churning out new classes of destroyers on a regular basis. They have essentially, replaced their Cold War fleet, which was basically a Russian knockoff, entirely in the last 20 years. And they're basing their ship designs on Western, American actually, basically Western models. And their ships are at sea a lot. That makes a big difference. After 2000, China, was building some new ships, but suddenly we were seeing them at sea a lot. And there were accidents. They lost one submarine because somebody hit the wrong valve, and the whole crew, died of asphyxiation. They've had their share of collisions and ships running aground and what have you. But they understood the importance of ships are not the key factor, the crews are. And if the crews are not trained, if they're not experienced, if they don't know how to handle their ships on a regular basis, they're not much good. Now we've seen that in the past, and the British Royal Navy, 3 centuries ago, demonstrated that they were able to uh, bear the expense of keeping those wooden ships at sea for long periods of time. And when it came to war, the Napoleonic Wars, ship for ship, the British were much superior. Plus, their officers were basically accustomed to moving ships around in different weather and different battle conditions. They basically outfought the enemy. On paper, the enemies, especially the French and the Spanish fleets, were equal to or larger, but it was the quality of the crews, the officers, and the sailors. That is a tradition the U.S. Navy carried on after World War II, because up until World War II, at, at, at the start of the 20th century, the U.S. Actually started building the first dreadnought, the modern battleship. This is a minor point of fact, but the British built theirs faster, so they became known as dreadnoughts and not Michigans. So the United States was on the ball, as it were, as far as new naval technology uh, went, and we were at the forefront of developing aircraft carriers, modern, submarines, and of course, after we pioneered the development of nuclear submarines. The Russians tried to compete, but they couldn't. The big problem was they didn't have the industrial base. They didn't have the factories and the personnel, most importantly, because it was a command economy. They had no entrepreneurs. That was a, crime against the state. And basically, everybody was waiting around for somebody to give them orders. That does not build decent warships, and the Russians are still suffering from that. Chinese, on the other hand, they basically, created the how should I put it? A communist police state without the command economy, which is basically what Nazi Germany was. Democratic social, what do you call it? Radical socialists, with allowing entrepreneurship, and that made an enormous difference because their firms could compete. They had to compete on a global scale, and they acquired the skills, the construction skills that the Russians never did. So they're turning out fairly good quality ships. Now, they haven't caught up with us in all categories, and they don't expect to for another 20 years. But they plan in the long term. They don't expect to be how should I put it, a global competitor for American military power until 2030s, 2040. So they're talking, 20 years out before they are able to match us. That still ignores the main question. A government like China, like Nazi Germany, was highly dependent upon keeping people happy. People don't understand this with the Nazis. During World War II, they kept producing a lot of consumer goods. The Russians, of course, boom, stopped it. Well, there weren't many consumer goods in Russia, communist World War II to begin with. But they didn't really mobilize industry for all-out war until 1943. And that was for political considerations. Hitler knew that he did not have, how should I put it, the support of the people if they were going to be greatly deprived. And he was right. Granted, the troops, they fought, but they ran out of troops. They ran out of, military capabilities, even with the mobilization in 1943. But they had to have, the popular support, as it were. The Chinese have the same problem. They have popular support as long as the economy keeps growing, as long as people feel they are getting rich, and they are. I mean, they basically are the major, how should I put it, force behind reducing abject poverty in the world over the last 30 years because they basically eliminated it. Well, they greatly reduced it. You still have about 15% of the Chinese population are living under very poor conditions. But they basically brought, in 2 generations, most Chinese into a level of economic prosperity they had never seen before. They had never experienced before. Now, this the Chinese understand is dangerous because you can give But if you take away, you're in big trouble. You lose that support real quick. And the Chinese need a lot of support if they're going to undergo a major war, which the Chinese people, they talk about it. I mean, the government talks about it. The officers are allowed to write books about the next enemy. They were doing this back in the 1990s, positing how a war with the United States, they were very explicit, would go. And it was a lot of fancy, how should I put it, fanciful, imaginative flag waving. But it was quite popular because everybody was getting rich. The military was finally modernizing, and that plays well. People like that, especially when they look at the map and they realize that unless China has sea access, which they never needed before, um, this prosperity will not continue. So they back the expansion of the fleet, but they don't really want a war. It's basically a game of bluff. If anybody actually uses the major and starts a shooting war, it's all over. The prosperity is gone. And then, of course, we're talking about two superpowers who have nuclear weapons. And this does not, play well in China because they basically, in the last 20 years, they ended 2 centuries of disasters. Political, military, economic. I mean, it was just a nightmare. And this plays well in China because it was basically the idea that the Communist Party has finally brought China into the sun. Of course, this sounds like I want to start a World War One, but the Germans demanding their place in the sun. They were the new ascendant power. Well, now it's China, and for the same reason that Germany was a threat, so are the Chinese, because once you have the instrument, as it were, once you have capable weapons and capable troops handling them, there's a temptation to use them. And for an aggressive country, like China is now, this is dangerous. One advantage the Americans have always had, and it gets taken for granted by our allies, is that we are basically an anti-war nation. Now, a lot of Americans say, "Oh, that's ridiculous." Well, no, it isn't. Look at the United States compared to everybody else. The United States is populated largely by people fleeing other countries that were constantly at war, that were run by dictatorships or basically inefficient governments. And if you look at American history, anytime we got into a war, any enthusiasm for the war evaporates after 3 years. Any war, even World War II. I mean, again, we it's a shame they don't teach history, like they used to, 50 years ago. Then you got into some of the details of what went on after World War II with the politicians and the tremendous pressure to get the troops home and demobilize. We had like 12 million people in uniform, and the American public was going to vote against any politician that didn't get them home at all cost, at all speed. That was the main reason for using the nuclear weapons against Japan. Although the Japanese tend to forget that if we hadn't done that, millions of Japanese would have starved to death or died during an invasion. And there was no way to force the Japanese to surrender without a weapon. I mean, the two nuclear bombs did less damage than a lot of the firebomb rounds. But it was the shock. Oh my God, that's a few. One bomb did that. And even then, the Japanese military, who had been running the country, since the 1920s and 30s, wanted to fight on. So again, that gets forgotten. But you cannot forget things like that because it happen again. The Chinese have real problems with having a navy that is scary enough to basically, make other countries feel, well, maybe we better not mess with these guys. But for a major war, that is immaterial. Because any war that would basically shut down the Chinese economy would make any support for China, evaporate very quickly and be the ultimate in self-destructive moves. Now, given that, China has basically built a navy that can dominate in, how should I put it, small wars. Crises that look like a war but don't quite get there. There might be shooting, but nobody's going to declare war. They cannot afford a major war, militarily and politically and economically. But their navy is getting larger, and it's basically like, how should I put it? Mine's bigger than yours, but mine's, and they were very much encouraged by those three destroyer collisions that the U.S. experienced over the last 2 years, which were basically attributed to poor, leadership. The crews were being pushed, maintenance wasn't being done, training wasn't being done. Once they looked into that, it revealed a lot of problems that the U.S. Navy was having that weren't being attended to. Now, at least we know about them. They're out there and they are being attended to, but it takes a while to turn that around. But the point is that Chinese don't know in terms of an intimidation navy, which is what they're talking about. What they have to worry about is not just the United States, but South Korea and Japan. They are they are together a larger naval threat than China. I mean, the large naval force in terms of ships, quality of crews, weapons, and what have you. And we tend to forget that. During the Cold War, it wasn't just the U.S. Navy you had to calculate, it was navies. Because if there was a major war with Russia, it was going to be the NATO alliance versus basically Russia and some subject country satellites, who they called allies but really weren't, were as likely to revolt against Russia as to aid them, whereas the NATO allies were basically united in defending themselves. China has no allies. China is in the same situation as Russia. Technically, Russia's an ally, but the Russian Navy continues to fall apart. I mean, there's fresh news daily. Their only aircraft carrier just had a major catastrophe when the dry dock it was in, sank, basically. That sounds weird, but, things happen, especially in Russia. So the Russian fleet is a non-entity, and there is no other naval ally they have. It's all Russia all by themselves. So they have to basically face South Korea and Japan, who have a high seas fleet. The Australians have a fairly significant fleet, not as large as the South Koreans and the Japanese, but it's a modern fleet. There are several other countries in Southeast Asia who are building, modern fleets, and it all adds up. When you add up all the numbers, how much naval force the United States can afford to put in the Far East at any given time. As Austin pointed out, the rule of three. Your ships, you can only get a third of them, overseas, on station, as it were, at one time, because the others have to go through maintenance, training, and some of the maintenance goes on for a year. So it's the rule of thirds. The Chinese are still basically a coastal, fleet. They're taking over. They're trying, and they're pretty successful at taking over the South China Sea and building mini aircraft carriers. These airstrips on the outer artificial islands. And they're doing that at great expense to themselves, not just in terms of money, but in terms of diplomatic, capital. They're basically proving to their neighbors that they are the bully in town. It used to be the Japanese for a short while actually, but now China's back, big and bad, and pushing the neighbors around, and they pay for that because they basically, like Russia, they have no allies. Everybody, even though Russia has countries that it can basically call on to vote for them, put them in the UN, or not make public, disputes, public, protests about some new, how should I put it, violation of international law that Chinese commit. They can't depend upon them if it comes to a war. If it comes to a war, everybody's going to line up with, United States, because the United States, is not an imperial power. The lesson of Philippines was noticed, because Philippines was the only American colony because of the Spanish-American War in 1898. But we had promised the Filipinos they get their freedom in 1945. The Japanese that was delayed 1 year. and they were free, and that made an impression. The Americans went out to propaganda aside, both from inside the United States and outside the United States. The United States cannot and will not sustain any imperial ambitions, and that is in contrast to China, which is redefining traditional Chinese territory to include more and more of East Asia. And that scares the heck out of most of the Chinese neighbors. So when you look at naval capability and you look at basing, you've got all these neighbors of China are more willing to accept U.S. naval ships or allow them to base there than they are Chinese ships. The Chinese have to basically build their own ports to sustain overseas operations. So yes, the Chinese are becoming a threat, but it's a brittle weapon. At the same time, the United States has another problem. We as the old saying goes, we have met the enemy and they are us. The chief agent of the weakening, as it were, of the U.S. fleet is what President Eisenhower described as the military-industrial complex. Well, actually, it was the military-industrial congressional complex, but he was a retiring president and a politician, so he felt he didn't have to say that. But it turns out that one of the biggest obstacles to building better ships and getting your bang for your buck, as it were, is the corruption between the Congress and the major companies that provide the warships. Basically, it's become unprofitable to do business with the U.S. Navy unless you're connected. In other words, unless you have enough political support to keep a inefficient shipyard or manufacturing operation open. A lot of companies simply do not want to do business with the Department of Defense. It's one of the big deals if you want to expand the fleet to 320 ships is for Congress to make a great sacrifice and to allow multi-year contracts, because normally Congress wants to sign off on military spending every year so they can get maximum political leverage out of it. Not to mention some economic leverage, but let's not go into that. You have a military-industrial, congressional complex, which basically is inefficient, and of course China doesn't have that yet, given time, because they're historically their military budget is legendary. I mean, literally, and goes back a lot longer, and they are aware of that. Anyway, so the problem we have with the U.S. Navy is because of this corruption problem, this military-industrial congressional complex, we haven't not been able to design new ships. Examples are the Seawolf submarine, overpriced. Basically, we have tried to design and failed the Seawolf submarine, the Zumwalt destroyer, the Littoral combat ship, and of course the new carrier, the replacement for the Nimitz. And this is you look at this and you say, how can it be so stupid? But that's what happens when you have politics and crony capitalism all coming together, and effective public relations departments in the companies, and spinning all sorts of fables, and then ships get out to sea. They say, "Oh my God, it doesn't work. How could that possibly happen?" With the Navy, the big problem is it went with the electromagnetic catapult, which sounds like a bright idea, but it was totally mismanaged, the design of it, and it not only is less reliable, it's not as effective as was promised. Surprise, surprise. That's nothing new in military procurement. But if one of the three catapults fails, they all fail. And they're trying to fix that, because without that, they crunch the numbers, and Ford is less effective as an aircraft carrier than the older design. And now we reported on this in Strategy Page, and there's been some coverage in the media, but it's not the sort of thing that makes for riveting journalism. But as a practical matter, it means carrier fleet is in big trouble, because we have a new design which hasn't been debugged. It won't work yet. We already have one ship built. There's another under construction, and it's unclear if they're going to fix this or not, because they weren't able to fix problems they encountered with the littoral combat ship, with the Zumwalt, and with the Seawolf. Now we were able to recover, but that's an expensive way to recover. You got this huge billions of dollars are wasted, years wasted, and what have you. All sorts of embarrassing, publicity, which is even bigger pain, as it were, to the guilty parties involved. But it means ships aren't being built. The military budget, huge chunks of it are being wasted. And here we are, and we've been doing this, for 30 years now. The ineffective shipbuilding, and the shipyards that can't build ships even when they have a decent design to work with. There's a lot of pressure to fix it, but there's still a lot of, how should I put it, quiet pushback, quiet but effective pushback, because, when you run into somebody else's, as the Chinese say, iron rice bowl, their entitlement, as it were, the politicians are going to go, basically support who pays them. And when I'm talking about the voters, that is, again, is something that doesn't make riveting journalism. So again, there are stories about it, and so it's not like it's a top secret, but it's a real factor. And if you look at the American fleet and the inability to build new, warships, that is a major factor. It cannot be ignored. Anytime the Navy says we have a new design, most people experienced in naval, modern naval history get nervous. They say, "Oh my God, they're going to ruin another class of ships." So our problems are primarily, people. Both the poor training, the cutting the maintenance budgets and what have you on the ships and making them less effective and dangerous to the crews, as we discovered with those collisions, but also unable to design and build new ships to replace the ones that are wearing out. And this is a problem that really doesn't. A lot of people in Washington don't like to discuss openly, and it has to be whispered about. But whispering often doesn't get the solutions, and that's the big problem we're up against. The Chinese, again, they're becoming a major factor. They have new weapons. They have the ability to do things that we can do things too, but in electronic, network warfare, which may be decisive in the next war. But they are still a coastal fleet, basically. I mean, they can go out, halfway into the Pacific. I mean, yeah, they've sent ships around on cruises around the world to show the flag, but that's mainly for propaganda purposes. As far as moving a fleet, they couldn't go as far as the Japanese fleet could in the opening period of World War II, and they're not really looking for that. They want a fleet that can dominate, their expanded definition of what is, Greater China, the kingdom under the heavens, as it were, in Chinese. And we have to go halfway around the world, across the Pacific, to confront that. Whereas for them, it's just defending their borders, which have now extended to the Straits of Malacca and the Indian Ocean.
So right now, Jim, we only have 10 aircraft carriers, 11 aircraft carriers when the next one's finished. And with the sort of this rule of three, that means that we really can only put about 4 aircraft carriers out at one time, which doesn't give us a lot of coverage. Is that one area where we need to build more platforms?
Well, you can if you had the carriers are well maintained, which the ships have not been. I mean, they've basically been during how should I put it, after 2004 or 2008. The military budget's cut because you can declare war over in Iraq and Afghanistan, which wasn't the case, but that's another problem. And the budgets, started to shrink, and the Navy was still being called on to keep a lot of ships out there, and they did that by cutting maintenance and training. They basically, if you have those 10 carriers, you can put 6 of them out there, but it means A lot more of the crew not going to re-enlist. They're not going to stay in because it's bad enough being away from your family for 6 months at a time. But to find yourself extended, to 8 or 9 months, or to come back only for 2 or 3 months, and then bingo to be off on another 6 month cruise. This made it very difficult for the Navy to hang on to, its experienced people, and that's a consideration because we are not at war. So no, you can surge periods, for up to a year, or whatever, but eventually those ships are not going to be operational, and you've got to put it into a port, whether it be in the West Pacific, in Japan or South Korea or whatever, and undergo maintenance, or they're just going to be breaking down there. You're going to have to go out there and tow them back. So no, I mean, normally, if you want to maintain that surgeability, you want to obey the rule of threes and keep maintenance up to date. And that means, you're only going to get 3 or 4 carriers out there, which is what they're trying to do now. And that's one reason why they're so eager to get the F-35B, the vertical takeoff version, which goes out on the amphibious carriers. Actually, we have 20 carriers if you count the large, amphibious ships, which look like small aircraft carriers. But they can carry half a dozen or more of these F-36Bs, and with smart bombs, this gives you a tremendous naval air capability, at a very low, price, as it were. But while that's adequate for counterterrorism and operations and such, it's not enough to really confront the Chinese in a major way. But right now, the war with China, the naval war with China, is a war of intimidation. Mine's better than yours. I got more. I got, they look spiffier and what have you. You're basically displaying your, it's like mating season in a deer herd. Whoever's got the biggest and most impressive looking antlers, whether or not that particular buck can fight, is going to win the ladies and win the fight, as it were. In this case, is fighting for public opinion in China as well as among the neighbors, and right now they're winning. I mean, they are churning out ships like there's no tomorrow, and it's very impressive. I mean, they built their latest aircraft carrier, which is somewhat halfway between one of our amphibious carriers and one of our Nimitz, but from start to finish, 3 years.
Yeah,
the actual construction too. We have not been. We could. There was a time when we could do that, but we can't do it anymore because there's so much. How should I put it? Things that have to be done and taken care of. And even then, when the ship is finished, will it work? The Chinese ships worked.
Right.
They're talking about electromagnetic, catapults. They're waiting for us to perfect the technology, then they'll steal it. I mean, they can't say that, but that's what they do. And so we're paying the price for being first.
Austin, we're almost out of time. Do you have anything to add as we wrap this up?
Yeah, I was going to come back and make 2 quick points. As Jim points out, one of the standards to right now and for the next couple of decades, the U.S. has to measure itself and its maritime warfare capabilities against is what China could do, can do. Jim correctly differentiates is that really what they will do, given the larger issues they struggle with domestically, both economically and socially. And bring this back to operational and really tactical to show you why you do need a certain quantity of ships. I want to say maybe it was probably 13 or 14 years ago. I read a article in a defense publication where you had a littoral combat type ship that was in semi-confined waters, but was protecting itself with drone and unmanned submersibles out to stop torpedoes and the like. And it was the as I'm the ship as a sensor platform, and all of these robots and drones and unmanned systems are really just an extension of my deck space. And here's the problem with that. It's there's some truth to it, can be, but all you got to do is the brain. If that littoral combat like ship is hit, knock it out. And sure, there's some of the semi-autonomous systems may be up by another U.S. ship to operate. Who knows what some of the fully autonomous systems would be doing? But you've won the sea battle. Things get more complicated at the instant that you have a second, much less a third ship there. And that's one of the reasons that when we really move a carrier task force in a power projection, an offensive situation, we move two, because that really complicates our adversaries. It complicates the problem for our adversaries to have two of them. That's a heck of a lot of money. That's a heck of a lot of gambling. What you say, we got 11, and I'm saying when we really go into an attack, 20%, right at 20% of our elite carriers are involved in this operation. Yeah. So you need a certain number of hulls. I don't know what the magic number is, but at least I think this morning we've laid out a lot of the considerations.
Right. Well, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Take care.